I'm going to call the meeting to order, Liz.
Certainly, I don't have it yet, but
Oh, sorry.
email, but I'll go ahead. Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Elizabeth Flores for the record, and we'll call the meeting of the Student Attendance Advisory Committee to order at 9:03. And with that, I believe we can move on to roll call.
Correct. Elizabeth Flores,
Present.
Lance Mesker, Lance Mesker,
He's not on the line.
not present.
No.
Carrie Pruitt,
Present.
Roger Botten,
Present.
Jason Trevino,
Present.
Lacey Keel,
Lacey will not be here today.
thank you.
Did you get the agenda, Liz, yet?
I did. Thank you very much. Okay. So roll call is complete. Okay.
Correct.
So we'll move on to item 1.03, public comment. Comments from the public are invited at this time on topics not specifically addressed elsewhere on the agenda. Due to the current state of emergency declared by the governor, members of the public wishing to make public comment to the Student Attendance Advisory Committee must submit their comments via email to dbroker@washowschools.net. Any public comments received will be forwarded to the Student Attendance Advisory Committee for its consideration, consistent with the emergency provisions noticed above. Item 1.04, action to adopt the agenda.
Excuse me, Liz, I have no emails for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Everyone should have received an agenda through your email from JJ for you to review. And then let the record show Lance Mesker has joined the meeting at 9:05.
okay. So we have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Move to adopt the agenda.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Is that Roger Botten? So on motion of Carrie Pruitt and seconded by Roger Botten, the Student Attendance Advisory Committee approved the agenda. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those
Aye.
opposed? All those opposed? Okay, motion carries. All right, we'll move on to item number 2, discussion, presentation, and action items. Do I need to reread this public comment disclaimer?
No, you do not.
Okay,
I have no public comments.
okay. So item 2.01, approval of the minutes of the November 13, 2020 Student Attendance Advisory Committee. Has everybody had an opportunity to approve or review so we can move forward with a vote? Okay. May I have a motion? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Lance Mesker for the record, motion to approve the minutes.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it, Jason.
Oh, go ahead.
Jason, okay. So on motion of Lance Mesker, seconded by Jason Trevino, the minutes from November 13, 2020 were approved as presented. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? No. Motion carries for the approval of the November 13th, 2020 minutes. Okay, with that, we will move on to item 2.02, presentation and discussion of current chronic absenteeism data.
Okay, I'm going to take over here. Rochelle Muriel for the record. Thanks everybody for being here. It's good to see everyone's faces. It's surprising that it's been since November since we have been able to meet. I wanted to give you a brief understanding of what chronic absenteeism looks like. The last time we met, we talked a little bit about it. So actually Laura Davidson is here and she will be presenting to us a little bit later on in the agenda, but she is our director in accountability around program evaluation and data. So she is the expert and her department has pulled the latest chronic absenteeism data for us to discuss and consider as part of our work that we do on this advisory council. And so I'm going to briefly go over it. It's really brand new. I think this is maybe only a week old, possibly, right, Laura? It's really new data. And so I'm going to go over it verbally. And then once I get the go ahead to release it to you in writing, then I'll send it to the group too for you to review in writing, because I know sometimes that's helpful to see a PowerPoint in writing as well. So I'm going to briefly go over and let me know if you have questions. Just stop me, okay, if you have any questions. And then I would like to have a little bit of time to discuss as partners, what are some of the things that we're seeing in our own agencies around chronic absenteeism and how is it impacting our own practice with the youth and children that we are serving. In previous years, in 2019, our chronic absenteeism for the overall school district was at 13%. We are currently this year at 37%. So the numbers, if I remember right back, looking back, 37% is over 22,000 students that are chronically absent in our school district. If we break it down into elementary, middle, and high school students, in 2019, our elementary students were at 11% chronic absenteeism rate. This year, they're at 23%. For middle school, in 2019, the chronic absenteeism rates were 13%. This year, we're at 44% for students that are in attending middle school. And at high school, we were previously in 2019 at 17% chronic absenteeism, and we are presently at a 51% chronically absent rate for students. And just to remind you, to be chronically absent, students have to miss 10% of the days they are enrolled in school. And so many of these students, this data that I'm giving you is chronically absent. It's not breaking it down into how many of those students are actually severely chronically absent. And those are some concerning numbers too, and the increases of how many students have become severely chronically absent. And that definition is 20% or more missing school during the days that they are enrolled. So it does fluctuate as students are enrolled for a longer period of time. So if a student was enrolled an entire school year, they would need to miss 18 days to be chronically absent. Okay, moving on, if we look at the learning models, we have talked about this before, but just a reminder, we have 3 different learning models of how students can engage in school currently. We have students that are completely distance learning, so they're fully distance learning students. We also have students that are hybrid, and so they alternate between days. So one day they'll go to school in person, the next day they'll do a distance learning day at their home. And so that's hybrid. That's typically middle and high school grades that are doing a hybrid learning model. And then we have in-person learning, and that is mostly for our students that are in elementary school, but we also have some special populations that are exempt that are allowed to choose to go to in-person at a middle and high school. And those are students that are identified as children in transition, students with individualized education plans, English language learners, let me think. Oh, students in foster care. I know I'm missing somebody, but there are some special populations that are exempt and can choose to go in person. They can also choose a hybrid or a distance learning, but they also have the opportunity to do in person 5 days a week when they fall into those categories. So just giving you a brief overview of what chronic absenteeism looks like in terms of the learning models. Overall in our school district, I printed it out in black and white, so I'm trying to look at these numbers. Looks like in our school district, 41% of students that are full distance learning are chronically absent. 47% of students that are in hybrid are chronically absent, and 25% of students that are enrolled in in-person learning are chronically absent. If we look at elementary school, we don't have, let's see, let me look at this really quick. It looks like in person, 22% of elementary students in person are chronically absent. There isn't a hybrid model. In distance learning for students in elementary school that chose to be in distance learning, 26% of them were chronically absent. In middle school, for students that were in distance learning, 40% of them are chronically absent. For distance learning middle school hybrid, 46% are chronically absent. And for distance learning in person, 42% were chronically absent. And then in high school, for distance learning, 59% of high school students are chronically absent. For hybrid, 47% of students were chronically absent. And in-person learning, 52% of students are chronically absent. Let me know. I know this is a lot of data and I don't have any visuals for you, so let me know. I'll stop for a second and see if there's any questions. Okay. Seeing none. All right. Did you have anything, Laura? I saw you unmute yourself. Okay.
No, you're good.
Okay. Really briefly, I would like to go over our race and ethnicity categories and then our special population categories, just to give you a sense of what it looks like for groups of students. This is a comparison between 2019 chronic absenteeism rates and current chronic absenteeism rates. So for our American Indian students in 2019, 19% of them were chronically absent, and it is up to 52% now for chronic absenteeism currently. For our Asian students, 6% were chronically absent in 2019, and it's up to 23%. For our Hispanic Latino students, 15% were previously chronically absent. In 2019, it is up to 46%. For African American students, 21% were chronically absent last year, and it's up to 54%. For our white students, 11% were chronically absent, and it's up to 28%. For our multiracial students, 15% were chronically absent, and is up to 34%. And for our Pacific Islander students, 19% were chronically absent, and is up to 57%. I'll pause for a second in case there's questions, and I have one more special populations to share with you. Okay, of our special populations, we're looking at students that are qualified under free and reduced lunch. So that's looking at income for students. In 2019, 17% were chronically absent. That's up to 47% now. Of students who have received special education services, previously it was 21%. It's up to 44% now. For our English language learners, previous numbers were 16%, we're up to 48% now. For our students in foster care, previously that was 21%, it's up to 43% now. For our children in transition program, those are students that are identified as homeless. It was previously 36%, it's up to 62% now. And our gifted and talented population, that was previously 6% and is up to 22% now. Sorry about that, I muted myself. So that's enough of me talking. Are there any questions about this data or discussion? And then if not, I'm also curious from all the partners out there how chronic absenteeism rates are impacting your practice as well.
This is Lance Mesger for the record. I was wondering, are we going to get, and maybe I missed it, if we were able to get a copy of that, because that was obviously really quick and be able to, pretty interesting. Obviously, we knew the numbers were going to be pretty staggering based on the pandemic. As far as our agency, it's definitely impacting our kids and overall motivation, right? And engagement. You know, a lot of times our population is really difficult to engage in education anyway. And then you throw on all the natural barriers of the pandemic. So, I mean, we're getting affected just like, you know, everyone else is. I did a kind of an anecdotal little reached out to all my officers who supervise and what are the barriers, and it's everything that everyone's accustomed to, the motivation to get them to log on, the ability to navigate a difficult system when they're not in school. And then, you know, a lot of the fears, right? Got a lot of the family members staying home because they're fearful of the kids going to school. So it's really, we're starting to see some, I believe, and obviously we don't have hard data yet, but we will in the end, is these kids' mental health is really being impacted by not having that structure and stability of what so much of the school provides, in not just the education realm, but the social and emotional support they get from, you know, mentors and teachers and just by being in that setting. So we're definitely seeing a slide, and hopefully that, you know, as we move forward, we can get back to some stability. And my fear is trying to re-engage these kids that we've lost from just the distant learning. So that's going to be a big challenge that I think we're going to have to face head on for sure.
Couldn't agree more. And to answer your question, Lance, yes, I will be able to get this to you. I just need to make sure that I double check and get approvals before I send it to you all, but then I'll be able to send it to you. So I do apologize. It was a lot of me talking. So hopefully you did get a sense of what it would look like, but you'll get it in a PowerPoint presentation.
This is Carrie Pruitt for the record. First, I want to say I'm kind of surprised that that the in-person numbers are so high, because in-person is what we know, what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Although I will say, for example, you know, the middle and high school, that they have been, I think, affected at a different level, especially through the holidays. So they had kind of an extra amount of time prior to and after the winter break where they were, where they had mandatory distance learning. And so that kind of threw them off their game, right? And then to get them engaged again and to get back to school, and to no fault of anyone other than COVID. So it's frustrating. And I know that it's obviously impacted, you know, all of our agencies, but for human services, like you were saying, Lance, we have so many more layers of issues that have been so exacerbated, I'm saying that correctly, from the effects of COVID and not being in their routine. I mean, we all benefit from our routines. And so this is exponential for these kids. We have kids that have been doing fantastic and ahead of schedule, and now not going to graduate, you know, and it's sad. And I know that a lot of kids that are not in the high risk categories, some high school presidents, student council presidents, and other kids that have fallen off the radar and just really struggling with, like you said, the motivation and the structure. And so anyhow, we are working to, you know, push in as much support as we can to the homes, and our educational advocates are working overtime to try to engage our kids and to keep them on track. But it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I mean, this particular data is bleak, and I know it's not uplifting for sure. Some of the stuff that Laura is going to present, I think, will show you that for some kids are thriving. So not all students are struggling, but a lot of them are, and motivation has been something that's just been really hard for all of them. So it's interesting to learn from what works for some kids and what doesn't work for others as we move through. Any other final thoughts on this one?
Charles Aglabat for the record. Rochelle?
Yeah.
I have a question. Does our truancy unit reaching out to these families and offering services? I know at least a couple of families involved in my caseload struggled with internet connection. So is the school district offering some of those? I've been reading a lot of news articles about families struggling with laptops and stuff like that. How about connections? I know for a fact that T-Mobile or Verizon offered free stuff for a couple of months, but after that, what are the families' options at this point?
Yeah, so I'm going to cover some of what we are doing in terms of like attendance officers and re-engagement specialists a little bit later in the agenda, but also just to answer that question, that schools typically have reached out to families. They have, when they were available, and it took a while to get a sufficient number of laptops ordered and in place and ready to go, reached out to families. Hotspots went out, laptops went out, hundreds and thousands of them have gone out to families. Sometimes they still struggle with, the hotspots not working. We got hotspots over at the family shelter so they could access that. So our IT department distributed them, and then schools reached out directly to families to ensure that they would get a laptop and a hotspot. In terms of how many students still don't have access, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what that looks like, but I could try to research that further to see what that looks like. But schools primarily are the first connection to, if they need a laptop, if they need Wi-Fi, getting that directly from the school, and they'll work with them to get that delivered if they need to, or a family can come and pick it up.
Yeah, Roger Botten for the record on that. I know our schools are doing everything they can when they find out if there is any issues. They try to address that immediately. They've loaned out, because the schools have had, many of the schools had a lot of laptops that used within classes. And I know I was at schools handing out laptops. Anytime there's an issue, we do everything we can to get that out to them, get them hotspot, get them a computer. So I think we've done, as best as we possibly can on that. I mean, if there is anything, get to the school and the school help. I know we're doing that all the time. So
I think some of the challenge that Roger is talking about is we did have to order a lot of laptops too, and so did every other school district across the nation. And so it was difficult to just get the laptops. And then there's a certain amount of programming and whatever. I'm not an IT person, but whatever they do to image that laptop to make sure that it's safe and it is doesn't allow students to access things that they shouldn't be accessing on a laptop and all sorts of things. So.
And I am wondering too, how much of the challenges related to technology affect the numbers, the staggering numbers that we just heard from you, and not just motivation. I mean, There are a lot of students out there who are motivated, but just don't have the resources. So I'm not really sure if we could address the truancy, the staggering numbers, with just by providing those resources to the family. So I'm hoping it's just that.
Yeah, I mean, and I still think that there's challenges around, even when you have a laptop and Wi-Fi, knowing how to log on, where to log on, where are my assignments. Some schools are doing an Edgenuity program, some do Teams. And so trying to navigate what that looks like for classes, I think has been a challenge for students. I know personally for my own daughter, it's been a challenge just trying to figure out where everything is and how to access it.
I
I think too, there's the challenge of, I know we worked with a student who was on distance learning for several months, and his internet, as long as we worked with him, was very questionable. But he was on distance learning, and I mean, the school did somehow miss that internet issue. And when I dropped off a hotspot for him, I know his family said, well, we got the notice about that hotspots were available, but we have internet, so we just didn't think that we qualified for a hotspot. So I think there are those challenges too, and they are dependent sometimes on teachers noticing that there's an internet issue out there and reaching out with supports. And then of course there's, I think, some embarrassment for some families to have to ask for those resources. So I think we're still struggling with some of those issues too.
And I think when we look nationally at struggles that school districts are having, it's pretty across the board what we're seeing, in terms of motivation. I think Lance talked about the implications of mental health on the mental health well-being of our students, access to technology, all those kinds of things. It's pretty across the board, across our nation, what our students are experiencing nationally. Anything else before we move on?
Okay. Thank you for that, Rochelle. And you're probably up on this one too. Item 2.
I know you guys, I'm sorry, you have to hear me talk for most of this meeting.
You have all the info. So we'll move on to item 2.04, discussion and update on current successes and barriers in supporting attendance from the perspective of a community partner.
Excuse me, Liz, we're on 203.
Did I skip one?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. 2.03, presentation of 2020-2021 school year attendance, student attendance review board outcomes.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're seeing. We're getting on, and Dodie will correct me if I'm wrong, I think she's getting probably between 6 to a dozen referrals every week from schools for the student attendance review board. We do them both at an elementary level and a high school level. Typically, we're a little bit more busy in a high school and a middle school, but this year we've received more elementary SARB requests. We started in late October, and Roger is on that board too, so feel free to jump in anytime, Roger, and give your opinion. So far, we've seen 28 students through the ESARB hearings. We have a case manager, Brenda Martinez, that's providing case management for every student that goes through ESARB for at least 45 days. So she's been busy, and we are booked out till March 10th right now with ESARB hearings. And I think I saw yesterday that we got a bunch more that were requested. So it's nice to see those elementary schools, because typically our outcomes are more positive, and they're a more significant outcome in terms of long-term implications to attendance at an elementary age, where we can really partner with families, figure out what the barriers are, and address those barriers directly for them. We have been fairly successful with getting families to log on. We've been doing them through Zoom because we can't meet in person. I have gone a couple times to a school and met in person, but for the most part, we've been doing them through Zoom. Sometimes families have difficulty logging on with Zoom, and then sometimes it's more convenient for them because they're working. And so we've had families who are on their lunch break, and they're able to get onto their phone and still meet with us and talk with us, so that we can discuss collaboratively how do we address the attendance issues with them in times where they otherwise would not have been participating because they had to work. So it's been kind of hit and miss. Sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's not a great thing, but we've done everything from being able to pay for a before school program for a mom who needed to leave work early and couldn't get her student to school, to helping to connect families to behavioral health services. So lots of good work going on at the ESARB level. We're currently at 29 cases at the SARB level. And so those have been complex this year and challenging. A lot of what we're seeing is motivation issues, but more than anything, it's trauma. And so that's concerning. Do you have anything, Roger, to add to it?
Michelle, excuse me, we're booking now for April 14th for an elementary SARMS.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we've seen an increase for a couple things. One, I've really pushed that within the elementary level, our meetings and trainings about addressing it. And I think, we've seen the numbers, and they're very concerning with attendance right now. And the counselors are concerned, so there's renewed emphasis on trying to do something. We still have a lot of times we just, elementary with parents who are just, I think, overwhelmed, and school is just on the back burner, and they're trying to handle all these other things, trauma things going on. And it's been really tough within those ESARBs, I think, trying to come up with, sometimes with parents who just aren't cooperating or won't, I think a lot of times it's human nature. We've always had problems with people's, and some people's motivation to get to school and to engage and do those things. And this just gives them more excuse not to, or to kind of disappear. The families that weren't really engaged with school and having a lot of contact, this is just easier for them to just kind of disappear. And there's a lot of frustration. I think that leads to more SARB in ESARB referrals. But I think it's good we've been more effective, I think, within elementary SARB than the other ones. So I'm glad to see the numbers go up. But I don't know, you saw those 30% attendance issues. It's just huge. And, like tripled what we've had before. So I don't know. It's my input. We try to address all those needs and everything we can within ESARB. I think it's a great process to support those families if we can get them all coming and cooperating. It is a frustrating time right now, though.
Yeah. Any other questions about the SARB? Okay. When you're ready, Liz.
Now, item 2.04, discussion and update on current successes and barriers in supporting attendance from the perspective of a community partner.
Okay, so I do want to give you a sense of what is happening and what our department is doing and what schools are doing to address chronic absenteeism, just to make sure that I address Charles's question too. So we currently have 6 attendance officers and 6 re-engagement specialists. So to be able to support the numbers that we're seeing right now is nearly impossible for us to do that. Also with the SARBs, we do see anywhere between 5 and 6 cases a day, but that still doesn't even touch some of the things that we're seeing. So schools are having to really brainstorm how do they reach out to families and make sure that they're okay, connect with them. Our school district did lose students between last year and this year. So we actually lost students in our overall enrollment. We don't always know where they went. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't know where they went. And so just to give you a sense of what springtime looked like, and I might be repeating myself, I couldn't remember if I told you guys that or what we did last spring in response to when we closed schools. There was a pretty significant number of students that schools had no contact with. They had called and tried to connect with them, and there was no communication. So our team went out and we did over 2,300 home visits, trying to connect with families during the springtime. So even though it was still kind of it was a scary time and staff were nervous about going out to homes, they dropped off notes to give families contact information so they knew who to contact. they dropped off laptops and hotspots. And most of the things that they did were drop off food boxes, because if you all recall, back in the springtime, food became a really big concern and need for families, and it still is. So we're continuing to respond to those needs. But that's what they did in the springtime. We've kind of shifted now a little bit, but we're still really focused on basic needs. And so we were lucky enough to get some grant funding to expand our Family Resource Center staff. So we got some extra staff through an ESSERS grant that our district applied for. We got a Family Resource Center specialist and 2 family advocates. Their numbers have gone through the roof in terms of individuals asking and needing access to basic needs like food and housing. Even though we're on an eviction moratorium, people are still, people can still be evicted depending on the reasons behind that eviction. And so since July 1, we've paid 910 power bills for individuals. So the power company deferred the power bills, but now it's come due, and families are coming in with thousands of dollars of power bills that are due. So we've been paying a lot of power bills. And NV Energy has been really, really supportive in providing extra support in that means for us. And so we've paid a lot of power bills just to make sure that people continue to have power and heat and everything that they need, especially when it's cold out. We've paid rent for 40 families so far, and we've served 1,181 families through the Family Resource Centers, and they're all asking for basic needs like food, clothing, rent, those kinds of things. So those extra staff have been really, really helpful in responding to families. Much of what they're doing right now is working with our attendance officers or re-engagement specialists so that when they identify a family that has a need, they directly connect them to the Family Resource Center. They also take phone calls, text messages, emails. So they've been doing a lot of virtual stuff as well. We also did a partnership with Human Services Agency, and Julia Ratty secured FEMA funding for resiliency counselors, and they placed they're placed in many different places, but they placed 3 of them with Family Resource Centers. So primarily they were focused on supporting individuals who had been diagnosed with COVID, had contracted COVID, or had family members that had contracted COVID, and helping them to get access to behavioral health services. And then when they were placed in Family Resource Centers, they continue to do that, but they also work directly with our clients that are coming in and supporting some of those needs too. So they're very helpful in terms of helping individuals access mental health services. We also got 1 extra officer through Title 4A. So that was last year. So we typically only had 5 attendance officers. We have 6 now. So that is, that's a great thing. And I think that's about it. But in terms of like community partners, I wanted to put out there, are there any successes or things from your perspectives that you're seeing in your agencies that we all should know about? Okay. All right, seeing none, I think, Liz, we can move on.
Okay, so with that, we'll move on to item 2.05, presentation and discussion of data from family surveys conducted by the district during the 2020-2021 school year.
This is Laura. Thank you, Laura, for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me today. I always love getting the survey data out to as many eyes as possible, since everyone has different perspectives on what it means and what we should do about it. So I appreciate being able to be here today. So as Rochelle mentioned, we have a pretty serious chronic absenteeism crisis going on right now. And we know as students get further and further behind that these issues are just going to exacerbate. So we're hoping that some of this data that we share today, and that we shared this with the board a few months ago, will help kind of identify some of the challenges that we know families are facing. I know you hear from families all the time, but I think seeing it all together in such large numbers as we have in this survey, I think it provides some pretty powerful insights into some of the challenges that we're all facing. So this survey was one that we administered in November and December of last year. It was open for about 5 weeks, and we have almost 19,000 responses, so 18,382. We also did some targeted interviews with families that don't typically complete our surveys that I'll talk about in a little bit, but that equates to about a 32.3% response rate, which for family surveys in our district is sizable. So surveys have been very popular ever since the pandemic started. And we're just incredibly thankful that families are showing up to provide their feedback about things like how reopening has gone for them that first semester, challenges that they're still facing, and some of their ideas for solutions as the year progresses. So down here at the bottom, you can see these are the percentage of each learning model represented in our family population who completed the survey. So this is roughly the percentage of families that we have in each of these learning models. So when we look at our survey responses, we have pretty proportionate representation from each of these learning models. So we're getting to hear feedback about each of these types of learning that our families are experiencing. Fairly representative or proportionate response rates from elementary, middle, and high school. We did deliver the survey in both Spanish and English. It was emailed out to families if we had an email address for them on file. We have about 3,000 families or so that don't have an email address listed. We sent them paper copies to their home with postage paid envelopes to return them. You can see immediately we only had about 1,000 responses in Spanish, and I'll talk again a little bit about some of the outreach we did around some of our Spanish-speaking families to make sure that we collected their feedback. But you can see immediately that group is underrepresented in our survey population, and not just this survey, but most district surveys. I always like to give a shout out to my colleague, Jennifer Harris here. She analyzed the almost 60,000 open-ended comments that families filled out through this survey. So that is quite a lot of data that she sifted through and developed code for to analyze themes. But you can see 60,000 comments. Families were very passionate about what was going on in their child's learning and wanted to, write extensively about the challenges that they were facing. Fairly proportionate response rates from special education. We are underrepresented from our English learner population in this survey, pretty proportionate for gifted and talented, and then about 8% of our surveys that we received were from district employees who also had children in the district. So down here you can see, typical of most of our family surveys, we have an underrepresentation from our English learner, Hispanic, African American, and American Indian students. But one of the efforts that we did for this survey in particular that I think was successful was we worked with our family graduation advocates and FACE liaisons, their community outreach specialists, and they called families who were Spanish speaking, African American, and American Indian to invite them to participate in the survey, which also led to just some really great conversations about the challenges those population groups in particular are facing right now. So I'll share some of the results from what the family graduation advocates and FACE liaisons had to tell us about those in-person interviews or phone interviews that they did with families that we know are not well represented in our surveys typically. So I'll jump right in. You'll immediately see a pretty consistent pattern in the data that we received from families, which is that in-person learning looks like it's going pretty well overall. But it's really the distance learning that's the challenge for most families. So we first asked families just I'll step back for a minute. So the way the survey worked, it's basically 2 surveys in one. So families indicated which learning model their child was on. And based on that, they received one of 2 surveys. So if they indicated that they had a child on in-person learning, they received just questions about in-person learning. If they had a child on distance learning, they received just questions about virtual learning. And then if they are on hybrid, meaning they experienced both in-person and distance learning, they received both sets of survey questions. So when you look at this data, you'll kind of understand how that plays out for families. But we first asked just, percentage of families who felt confident supporting their child's in-person learning. And over here, this is the summary of all this data, but almost 90% of our families whose children are in person learning full-time felt very or extremely confident supporting their child's learning. And then for hybrid families, when they're reflecting just on the in-person learning days that their children were experiencing, still very high, about 70% said that they felt very confident or extremely confident. And then down here, we asked about distance days specifically. So you can see those numbers go down pretty quickly when we ask about distance learning. So 55% of families whose children are on full distance learning say that they felt very or extremely confident. And it goes down to 25% when we're asking hybrid families about just the distance learning days. And this is a pattern you're going to see sort of throughout this presentation, that hybrid learning, and especially those distance learning days when they're home, are the biggest challenge for families. Certainly distance learning is a challenge for families as well, but the families who are on hybrid and those days when they're not at home are particularly difficult for our families. Okay, so we also asked about how engaged students were in learning, depending on which model families' children were on. Again, you can see almost 90% of families who are in in-person learning full-time say kids are feeling really engaged, everything's going okay there. Declines a little bit for hybrid in-person days, but overall very high. Students are feeling engaged in in-person learning. When we look at full distance learning, again, drops down to about half feel their students are very or extremely engaged. And then even further when we look at hybrid distance days. So only a quarter of families are saying that their kids are engaged in that learning model when they're at home. So we also asked just overall effectiveness. So how effective is the overall in-person or distance learning model at your child's school? Again, exact same pattern. In-person learning, fairly effective, very effective for in-person learning, declines a little bit for hybrid. And then this number in particular, I find very concerning, that when we ask about hybrid learning distance days, almost just about 10% of our families say that the hybrid learning distance day model is very or extremely effective at their site. So pretty clear pattern here that the hybrid learning distance days are the most challenging for our families. So we asked about different aspects of distance learning for both our hybrid and full distance learning families, and how easy or very easy, if they were very easy or difficult or very difficult. So this is showing the percentage of families who say that these aspects of distance learning were easy or very easy. So down here at the bottom are where the challenges are. And again, you can see a pretty quick pattern here that hybrid learning is more difficult for families. And so the biggest challenges families face across the board are knowing who to contact for help with technology, motivation, which I know we've talked about, accessing distance learning activities and lessons. So especially for our students on hybrid, just knowing where to go to even get the activities that they're supposed to be doing on the day that they're home is a challenge for them. Managing household obligations with learning, and then navigating the multiple technology platforms. And that's something we heard loud and clear in the comments that I'll show you in a bit. So we also asked families, we gave them a list of possible concerns that they might have about their child's learning and asked if they were the level of concern they had about each of these issues. So far and away across all learning types, families were most concerned about their child's, academic growth. But again, you can see for hybrid learners, that's the kind of scariest one to us, that almost 2/3 of our families are saying that they are very or extremely concerned about their child's academic growth. Again, not as large an issue in person, largely elementary school. And then I guess the good news out of here is that behavior is much less of a challenge for our families this year. And I think impressively, not as many concerns about children's physical health. And when we asked some questions about in-person safety measures at schools, and by and large, families who experience in-person learning are saying that the safety precautions schools have in place are going really well. We do see concerns, especially again among our hybrid learners, about their children's mental well-being and peer relationships. And we'll show a little bit in a minute here about some of the challenges families are experiencing with having relationships with teachers, given the pandemic, and especially on distance and hybrid learning. So we asked that set of questions that I just showed you in the spring when we did, right after the pandemic started, we launched a survey about distance learning to gauge sort of the challenges that families were already facing back then with distance learning. And I think we were all hoping to see that those challenges would be diminished, right? That families would be more comfortable with distance learning and feeling more comfortable about their children's academic growth now than right when the pandemic started. But by and large, we see more families expressing concern about their children's academic growth this year compared to last year. And in certain population groups, although most were around, a third said that they were very or extremely concerned with their academic growth in the spring, the jumps are much bigger for certain population groups. So Black or African American, white, Native American or Alaska Native, and multiracial families are reporting pretty sizable gains in concern about their child's academic growth now compared to when we asked those same questions in the spring. I'm not showing it here today, but we asked that for each of those areas, and families are much more concerned in all of these areas. So much more concerned about their children's mental well-being, much more concerned about peer relationships, much more concerned about teacher relationships now than they were in the spring when the pandemic started. We asked a series of questions about family-school relationships in this survey, and again, display the results by learning model. So again, you can see that our hybrid learners, this is the percentage who agree or strongly agree that I know who to contact with questions about my child's education. So across the board, our hybrid families feel less connected to the school, or report feeling less connected to the school, and feel less sure about who to outreach for things like schoolwork, or having someone at the school that their child can confide in. So, across the board, again, that hybrid learning seems to be the biggest challenge for families, but distance learning is not too much better. So again, back to those 60,000 open-ended comments, we asked 3 questions where families could type into a text box their responses. And the first question we asked was, what is the most pressing challenge you're experiencing right now with your child's education? We had almost 17,000 families provide a response to that question. And the way we code this data is we have a large template, and we look for keywords related to themes that we can see are going to emerge. So for example, when we're asking about things like safety, we'll look for words like mask wearing, hygiene, hand washing, and based on the number of times those terms show up in an open-ended comment is how we get these percentages here. So it's an imperfect system, but it gives us at least a rough sense of the themes that the number of times a theme emerges in most comments. So that's why these are rough numbers, but it looks like about a quarter of all responses families gave about the biggest challenge they're facing were around instructional quality. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the things that families are requesting, but the challenges they were facing was just inconsistency from A day to a B day. They were also talking about not having enough live instructions, and families were saying that, kids were having to teach themselves a lot of the material, or were receiving activities on their home day for hybrid that hadn't been covered yet on the A day. Families who were in person in secondary every day were saying that there was no difference in what they learned on A and B days. So they were getting the material twice. So lots of challenges with instructional quality across the board, but particularly for hybrid and distance learning. I'm sure this will not be a surprise to this group, but almost 20% of our families wrote a response about being concerned about their children's emotional well-being, particularly the social isolation, anxiety, and depression that they faced. About 10% were around technology challenges, which we know this has to do a little bit with the timing. I think we got laptops out to families a little later this year. So some of this has to do, I'm hoping we address some of the technology challenges they're facing, but most of these comments were not necessarily about not having a laptop or a hotspot. They were more about having too many platforms to navigate, glitches in the technology students were using, and just not knowing where to access how to take attendance for their child. It's more platform issues than hardware issues. COVID and safety measures, that was mainly for in-person learning. So challenges with their children having to wear masks, or having to social distance at school, or not being able to play on the playground equipment at sites. About 5% were around, 6% were around school communication. So just not getting responses back from teachers in a timely manner was what the bulk of those comments were about. Competing home demands, and then just the challenges of coding attendance and turning in assignments on distance platforms. So I think this quote summarizes nicely what a lot of the families' comments looked like. So I'll give you a minute just to read that. Okay, so we also asked families, all right, you've provided your list of challenges that you're facing. How would you recommend the district address the challenge that you described? So we had about 16,000 responses again on this. Most called for just improve instruction, and most frequently they wanted instruction time with a live teacher. So having students teach themselves was pretty difficult. Many brought up that issue of the consistent instruction for in-person and learning. So not having to have repetition on A and B days, and just wanting more timely feedback and responses to questions about homework or assignments, or what children were learning on their off days. About 15%, 16% called for schools to reopen. They just want to be back in person, and that was to help address learning and emotional well-being. About 12% just said we need streamlined platforms and increased access to technology. And then families were sort of a 50-50 split on they either want to get rid of the safety measures that we have in schools, like masks and hand washing, or they want staff and other students to better adhere to those safety measures. And this is a comment representing some of these comments, and I'll give you a minute to read that. Okay, we did ask what is working well within your child's learning, and I think these are kind of representative of just how amazingly resilient our families and students and staff are this year, and give us a lot of hope, certainly as we think to the future. But about 14% said the academic and emotional growth within the current learning model looked good. They were happy with how their children were learning and growing in this period. A lot of shout outs to schools for just the incredible work that they've done to make all of this happen this year, and giving families lots of choice for learning models, incredibly caring teachers and school staff. These ones I love. Again, they speak so much to the incredible resilience our staff, students, and families have demonstrated this year. And families have said, you know, in some ways it's been great. I've been able to connect with my family more deeply. We're around more. We're isolated in our pod, and that's really helped our family grow. That children have learned a lot about things like self-management through this process. They've learned resilience, and that, you know, the family supports for learning have been really productive. Some have said distance learning is great. We want it to stick around forever. My children have been bullied a lot at in-person learning, so distance learning has worked out really well for us, and my children are loving it, and have about 5% said, you know, communication with school has been amazing. So this is a nice comment, I think, to sum up what schools are doing really, really well under incredibly challenging circumstances. Okay, I pulled out just for this group, since I know you're focused on attendance, comments specific to attendance, so you can get a little bit of a flavor of what families are saying about attendance issues at their school. So the overarching themes that families wrote about in terms of attendance is, you know, the tracking is really difficult over distance learning, that, you know, their kids forget to do the attendance survey to check in. And we know when we show those chronic absenteeism rates, we don't know what proportion of that chronic absenteeism rate is just, you know, the difficulty of knowing when a child is there or not, just because of the distance learning environment. So families acknowledge that too, that even communicating to their school that their child is attending that day is very difficult, and staff say the same thing, of course. They do talk again about motivation and engagement being challenging this year. This family says, you know, they really need to be in school every day. They do nothing on those stay home days other than read and check in for attendance. Staff say the same thing on the staff survey when we ask about that. And then, you know, families definitely acknowledge just how incredibly stressful it's been, and just getting their kid to log in every day is sometimes, you know, the best we can hope for. So health issues, family stressors are all big barriers to attendance. So a lot of schoolwork's very stressful. My son has more than 200 assignments. We have one computer. We are concerned about, you know, being ill with symptoms of possible COVID. So families just have multiple challenges that they face on basically every area that we've talked about already. I did want to just pull these results out quickly again. Just a reminder, we did those interviews with our families who were Spanish speaking, Black or African American or American Indian, because we know that those three population groups have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So we wanted to make sure that even if they didn't fill out our surveys, we were getting feedback about their experience specifically. So huge shout out to our family graduation advocates and FACE liaisons for doing these phone calls to families. They had really rich conversations that I don't think we would have known some of these themes if we hadn't done those phone calls. And we did end up contacting about 332 families who tend to be underrepresented in our surveys. And from those conversations, families just really appreciated that personal contact and having an opportunity to be heard outside of just a district survey that I think is very easy to delete sometimes, especially when you have so much going on at home. Families said they weren't confident assuming the teaching role. They wanted more communication from teachers. Many just said, you know, a lot of the materials we get from schools need to be translated into Spanish. They come in English, and that's hard for us to access. And then many, through those conversations, learned that their children were failing or had been absent, and they had no idea. And so they had really requested that more teachers contact them at the very first sign of struggle, since during those interviews they found out their children had been absent or failing, and you know, as the later we catch them, the harder it is to do something about it. So I'll close here for questions, but just want to give a big thank you to the almost 19,000 family members who participated in this survey, and hopefully provide some helpful information for your work. And just a reference point of what we've done with some of this information, schools received their school level results from families as well. So they have access to all the comments that families at their school provided.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great information. I did want to ask if anyone from the group had questions or anything that you'd like to say, anything that stands out to you about these survey results. It was a fairly large number of families that responded, so it's good information for us to look at.
Lance Mesger for the record. Obviously, we're going to continue to hit peaks and valleys during all this. Is there conversations and discussion about really having a strong plan to address a lot of these concerns, and they're valid concerns? I have a child in the district and echo, a lot of those concerns, and my kid's struggling as well. To address these by the next school year, or even during the last part of this year. Because we are losing kids every day, and if we don't have a real strong plan moving forward day to day to really aggressively attack and provide more support for kids and families that are even given now, we're in trouble.
Rochelle, you can answer, or I can say, there are several committees at the district who are putting together a plan for academic recovery, especially looking at summer and how can we, recoup some of the damage from this year with students. So I'll leave it at that. I don't sit on that committee, but I know there are many people starting to look at this data and putting together a plan for how to address some of these issues.
Well, and I would only add, Lance, that they're also looking at strategies to re-engage students. And when I say re-engage, it is that connection with relationships, but it's also academically. How do we re-engage students? How do we support them academically as they return? Our Board of Trustees has decisions that they need to make around what school is going to look like next year too. So those are decisions that I'm sure we'll see coming in the next couple of months, to see what will it look like next year.
Yeah, I sit on several of those committees, teaching, learning, connections and community committees. And there's a lot of people looking at what is going on, how we can address those needs. Also, even down to how we can, address students' feeling of belonging as they return and connect to school. And if we open up or we don't open up, and come up with plans academically and social emotional issues and addressing all those. So it is something they're taking very seriously, and a lot of effort is being put into that.
Charles Aglabot, for the record, I just have a question. I'm not sure if Roger or Rochelle can answer this. Are the truancy officers going to be involved in those re-engagement efforts, or is the school district thinking about creating another unit or hiring some other people?
I can say that our school district is facing some pretty serious funding cuts, and so I would not anticipate we'll get more staff. But to that point, I think that this is there's only 6 attendance officers and 6 re-engagement specialists. And so some of that work in terms of reaching families and developing relationships, and I'm just a big proponent of that. I think that we have to build really meaningful relationships with families so that they do feel connected. That needs to happen, and that work does happen at a school site level, because those are the individuals that kids and families are going to be interacting with on a daily basis. And schools have really learned and figured out creative, innovative ways to reach out to families, to figure out how to connect with them. And I think there's still a lot of work left to do for schools. So it's going to need to be a district-wide effort for us to reach families ones that we've lost, ones that are feeling disengaged and not connected. And so it's going to need to be not just on the 12 people that are in my department, but everybody across our district that are really trying to connect with families.
Liz Flores, for the record, I have a question, and I'm not sure, Rochelle or Laura, if you have the answer, but traditionally pre-COVID times, there were implications for children who were chronically truant or severely chronically truant as far as progression. Do you have any idea what the response will be for the children who are, it's like half of all children now who potentially fall into that category? What will the impact be for them as far as progression onto the next grade?
So previously our school district last year made a decision to not retain students. This year, my understanding is it is up to the discretion of the principal and the family to decide whether students should be retained based solely on a couple of things. Academically, would it benefit a student to stay in their grade, and socially and emotionally, what would be the impact? Some of the research that we look at in terms of the benefits or the not good things about retention is that it's not always a good thing for students as they get older. So it's a discussion that a team needs to make together with the family to decide if it's in the best interest for that student.
Thank you.
Do you have anything, Laura, to add to that?
No, I think the messaging certainly has been acknowledge the context in which all of this is occurring and think about what is in the best interest of a child, knowing this is a strange year. So, but yeah.
And yeah, when you look at high school, students are not really retained in high school. They just don't earn credit if they don't pass their classes. Mm-hmm. So that is a concern for students in high school, because if they're not passing their class, they're not getting the credits that they need to move forward towards graduation.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say, just given the number of incomplete grades that were given out in the fall instead of Fs, so teachers could give an incomplete and say, you got more time, like, let's make sure that you're completing this course. I would say schools are definitely acknowledging the challenges students are facing this year and probably granting more leniency this year than they typically would.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts about the survey? Okay, thanks again, Laura. We really appreciate you being here and presenting.
Okay, with that, we can close that item and move on to item number 3, closing items. Is there any public comment, Dodie?
No, I have no emails for public comment.
Okay, so then at this point, it looks like item 3.02, which is the announcement of the next meeting, which would be May 14th, 2021. Would that again be at 9 a.m.?
Yes.
Okay. So at this point, item 3.03, meeting adjournment. Do I read this? Or do I just ask for a motion to adjourn?
I don't think we have to do a motion to adjourn. You can just conclude the meeting.
Okay.
That's correct.
Is there anything further that anybody would like to say before we adjourn? Nope. Okay. Well,
thanks everybody for being here. We appreciate you listening to us about everything that's going on.
Thank you for all the information.
Yeah, thank you for the information, for all the work you do. This is tough for everybody, so we can appreciate that. And with that, we'll adjourn at 10:15. Thank